YouTube. I'm just going to double check the stream, and then I believe we should be all set. Thanks again for bearing with me. Yes, it's live. Do we have audio?
Hey, sorry, I'm a bit late.
Oh, it's cool. Oh, yeah, we do. All right, everything works. Cool. Thank you. Well, with that auspicious start, we're live on YouTube. Thanks, everyone. John, how was your collection?
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. I had a kind of issue where I didn't know exactly how long things were taking, so I didn't have a timer, and like the eyes closed one, so I don't actually know how long that was going for. But yeah, it was all good. I mean, these were very short. Like I put people in dark rooms and make them sit there for like 50 minutes. So sitting with your eyes closed for 3 minutes is not asking for much. So no major complaints in terms of from a participant point of view from that perspective.
Nice. I was able to do them as well. I didn't upload them on the repo, but that's easy enough to do. But I do have the 4 recordings. So if you want, we can. I wasn't sure how you were planning to look at them. I hacked together a really ugly thing in case you didn't want to code something up live, so we can at least inspect the data. Or I don't know if you wanted to walk through like here's how to load the CSV into M&E type of thing.
Yeah, that's what it's going to be. I got some stuff together, but it is going to be kind of a live hack as well. So so we'll just kind of string stuff together as we go.
Yes, let's see if I can do the horrible hack thing that I had planned.
What I'm doing first, I am going to push these files to the repo just because it'll be a little bit easier to kind of look at them if they're in the same place.
Right. All right. Let me get them on there as well.
But why don't you? I don't know if you've done this yet, Alex. But why don't you kind of go through the
the protocol,
the instructions that you put together?
Yes. Okay. Let me share the screen and do that. Cool. So.
This was designed, what would you say, yesterday? When we had like a bit of back and forth on the Slack, right?
Yes, it was an extremely robust protocol.
Yeah.
So the idea was, hey,
sorry to interrupt, but I did literally, I'm pretty sure within 5 minutes of Alex messaging me saying, hey, how are we going to do this? I'd made the repo Project Spicy and added him and made many of the files that, that have nothing in them, but they're kind of placeholder files. So it was very quick
that was the fastest
to get
Battlefield promotion that I received in a while.
Yeah, but the pace since that time, like yesterday, has been not quite as fast.
Yeah, so to go with the data collection challenge for May, the challenge that we're doing is, hey, can we find a difference when eating spicy food compared to a baseline? So for this week, what we were doing is grabbing that baseline. Now, to make it somewhat scientific, we set up a repo and we came up with a protocol for the people to do. So if you're following along and doing your own data collection, this is probably going to be a decent protocol for you to replicate so that when you're trying to replicate our analysis, you've got the files in the same format and the structure and so on. So what is the protocol? Well, it's not that super fancy. It's just real straightforward. First off, grab a 3-minute baseline, eyes closed. So like John was saying, there's a little bit of an occupational hazard there, which is you can be hard to tell the passage of time with your eyes closed where you're trying to relax. I use a second device with a timer, like my smartphone. I set it to about 15 seconds after the recording. I personally have a pretty nasty P300 jump for some reason when I'm waiting for the, the audio tone or whatever. So yeah, I set it a little bit after. So with Muse LSL, the package that I was showing, and I'll definitely show the syntax today of how I recorded it. It's very straightforward to set the time that you would like to do by telling Muse LSL how long to record. So type Muse LSL. Let's just verify that the Muse is still streaming. Oh, let's view. Cool. So I'm not wearing it at the moment, but as you can see, it's still streaming, and it's streaming ambient noise just like we would expect. Okay, cool. So with Muse LSL, the commands that we use to record this is basically create a folder so that you've got, your repository where you would like it. And then Muse LSL. And now, if you're not sure of the syntax, you can always just type Muse LSL or give it the wrong command like I did. And what that will do is enumerate all the valid commands. So you've got list, stream, view, and record. So right now we're going to record. And that means that the flag that's going to be useful for us is duration and the file name. So these are going to be the main ones that we want. So let's give it the arguments that it's looking for. Record -d 180. This duration is in seconds. So that's going to give you a flat 3-minute file. And you give it a file name. And in this case, and try not to put a slash at the end, but yeah, that's pretty much it. So this is going to sit here for, it didn't like, yeah. So this is going to sit here for 3 minutes and record ambient noise. And we'll just let it do that while we take a look at the page. And then when it, nope. Permission, oh, I'm sorry. It didn't like the permissions there. Oh, tell me I don't need to run as admin. But I shouldn't. I don't know. That shouldn't be privileged. It's got the right syntax. Okay.
I have a quick question.
Sure.
So generally, when we do a baseline recording and say, for example, the first step here is to keep your eyes closed.
Mm-hmm.
Would any auditory input evoke some type of response which wouldn't be considered as baseline? So do we also, like, along with closing our eyes, do we also but like get rid of any possible noise as well, or does it not matter?
As far as you can, yeah, and it kind of depends how far you want to go. But if you want to do this well, then you're at least going to want to kind of go in a room and close the door and turn off the TV or whatever.
Because so I'm recording currently, and I think every time I hear any keyboard noises, I see some changes in the signal. Not sure if it's related or if it's something else, but yeah, just wanted to understand.
You're unlikely to see an auditory or a visual response in the time series kind of by eye for a single event. Normally, you only really see like an auditory response when you take 50 auditory responses and line them up at with the onset at the same time and then average them. Like you might see a little bit, but especially visually, it's not something that you're going to say, oh, that big thing there, that was me hearing that sound. That's not what the brain responses to sounds and pictures look like. If you see something, you know, big and like really noticeable, it'll be some kind of artifact.
Okay.
And
okay.
it could be movement or something that's kind of associated with that stimulus, but not the brain response itself.
And I think what John's referring, I don't mean to speak for John. John, you're referring to looking at the raw, right?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So the interpreting the raw is very, very tricky, like John said, but there may be subtle changes. You're probably not going to be able to parse them, right? The raw signal is going to be a little bit different depending on what components are going into it, but it's not like you're going to be like, oh, a grad student that's looked at a ton of data might actually be able to say, oh, I see that there's delta in there, which is actually pretty funny because one of the neuroscientists that I was working with was doing that, and it was pretty funny when his predictions were accurate. But at the same time, like, that's not right. In terms of the cleanness of the baseline, I would say there's two kinds of baselines, or at least I consider there to be two kinds of baselines. There's a contrast baseline and then a computational baseline. So there is an EEG technique where you can divide any data that you collect by your baseline. And that's really a great way of giving you relative changes to any start condition. So my suggestion is if you're gonna divide, there's two ways that you can try to get a cleaner baseline, because as you realize, right, there's a lot of variation. First one is just take a bunch. At some point, you're going to get one that's really clean. So if you take 20, right, you'll have a pretty good sense of what's your kind of like best baseline, although they'll change over time. The other thing that you can do is you can record longer than you want, and that way you can trim out any artifacts that are either at the start or at the end. So it's harder to trim out the middle, but let's say you've got, a 6-minute recording and you're only looking for 3 minutes. You can dump the first minute if you thought there were any distractions in there, dump the last minute if you thought there were any distractions in there, dump an arbitrary extra minute, and you've still got 3 minutes of baseline data if that's what you're looking for. So definitely, like, there's a bunch of different techniques for making sure that they're super clean if you're going to do one and consider it authoritative. And then there's then there's trimming, and then there's multiple baselines if you want.
Oh, so you mentioned contrast baseline and computational?
Right. So a contrast baseline, I consider like that's a really coarse thing where if I'm just trying to look at two conditions and I'm not super, like, I'm not going to do anything with it, but I'm just iterating. I'm prototyping, what does it look like when I do this versus that? I think it's, in some cases, it's okay to use kind of like a messy baseline if you're just experimenting, if you're just doing very, very coarse comparisons. So not the real analysis that John's talking about, where you're averaging 200 trials and you want it to be time locked and super clean, right? Then you want to be as precise as possible. But I would say like you can do a quick and dirty baseline if you're just trying to do some quick and dirty comparisons.
And the computational baseline is what you mentioned, averaging multiple files, right?
Yes, or anytime you just want to divide real stimulus by a baseline is an extremely sound method to compare EEG. So if you had a recording of in this case, like watching the YouTube video, you could analyze that data in a bunch of different ways. You could look at the baseline by itself. You could look at the YouTube video by itself. You could visually identify the differences. You could calculate them. But then there's the other techniques, like where you divide the data in the YouTube video by the data in the baseline. And that gives you kind of like a ratio difference of the two.
Okay.
So my suggestion is anytime you're going to be dividing, subtract is also another valid method. So yeah, I would say try to get a super clean recording if you're going to record, divide, subtract, or manipulate by the baseline. But if you're just comparing, it's okay to have some ambient noise if you're simply trying to get like a general sense of how are these two different.
Got it. Got it. So when you're subtracting, you want to make sure that your baseline is super clean so that
Right.
you can maximize your signal in the actual region of interest.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the file finished recording. So now we know testing May 13 is now a 3-minute CSV full of not much ambient electrical noise, but this is pretty much the method that we use. So, you know, if you have Muse LSL installed from last week's Hack Night, then just this command. And I had a Windows privilege issue, so I fixed that by making it admin, but you shouldn't have too many problems with that. You can either open an administrator prompt, or if you right-click a command prompt, you can run it as admin. Same process as before. You're going to get a user escalation prompt, but then after that, you'll have an admin window. Typically, it's not necessary. I don't know why it was being picky today. Okay, so here is the 2 stimulus items that we chose for today. So that's watching this video. Now, why did I pick this video? YouTube released information a while back saying this was their highest engagement video on the platform. So this was actually something we did. Neurotech Berkeley did an experiment in an economics lab where they wanted to see the professor's, you know, presentation and whatever. So one of the contrasts that they did was having this video play like right in the middle of the professor's lecture. So the idea was, you know, you're going from a moderately engaging stimulus of the lecture to what YouTube considered their highest engagement stimulus video on the platform. So according to them, this was the video that if people started, they were the least likely to click out of because, you know, it's what they want. So this is just a racing around video. It's this video series called Gymkhana from a stunt car driver named Ken Block. And in this particular one, he goes to San Francisco and does ridiculous things with the doors closed. So, but it's kind of cool because it's a very visceral, very well shot, very, you know, high frame rate, immersive thing. And so it should generate some brain responses, you know, from that whole proxy processing of the stimulus. So that's the video. The idea is we want something exciting so that, you know, so that we get a response. Then the second one that we chose was reading an article. Now, this is probably not going to generate as much brain signal as the previous one, but I found some interesting contrasts with the reading task before. I have no idea if it will or won't come out today. I'd bet against it. But, you know, what I would say is I would expect this to be more of a frequency shift than a power. And I would expect the YouTube to be a little more power than frequency. But, you know, who's to say, right? We'll take a look at the data and hopefully we'll get that information. So this is a 9-minute article. It's fairly dense. Talks about OpenBCI's Galia helmet, which is super exciting that this is coming down the road. And, you know, any VR studio that wants to instrument their players will have this tool, which is really sweet. But yeah, this is, you know, a fairly dense article talking about all the challenges that they had getting through it. And so the idea was like, okay, you know, this should be a decent reading task. So when we finish all that, you know, we end up with a variety of recordings. Now here we picked some file syntax. If you're going to be doing any experiments or recordings, something you'll probably discover fairly early is settling on a naming convention makes life a lot easier. So, you know, just have a way to find your files. And in this case, you know, you can just use something simple like subject, condition, task. So obviously you can use whatever structure you would like, but that's kind of, if you don't have anything else, you can start with that and experiment with it and see how it goes. So you end up with a bunch of CSVs that are similar length, and that's cool because you're setting it to a 3-minute recording, and it's good to see that the lengths are similar-ish because we should be getting roughly a similar number of samples. So last week we took a look at the raw information, and that's just, hey, let's open it up. Let's plot some of the electrodes and see what the signal quality is like. But this is not going to be super informative. This is just going to tell you what's this data looking like. Okay, there's a little bit of spikes, but for the most part, looks all right. And this is a good way to kind of get a feel for your channels, get a feel for Excel crashing, and whatever else is going on with your data. So yeah, the recordings look similar to the ones last week, except last week we were dealing with tiny files, and these are about 30 seconds. So yes, thank you, Microsoft. All right, goodness. All right. So yeah, these are the files. Now I'm going to put these on the GitHub repo, but we do have the 4 conditions. So Mr. John, would you like to try loading one of your files into CSV? Let me stop sharing as well. Or if you'd like a little more time, I can go with the hack method if we want to have something to show.
I'm still putting it together. I'm kind of pushing things
Perfect.
and putting stuff together, so you can kind of, if you can stall.
Oh yes.
Longer, then I'll have some stuff to look at fairly soon.
No. We're gonna
I have no idea what it's going to look like. I haven't looked at these things yet. But
yes. No. That's okay. So let's start with the baseline. I'm thinking Unix.
Can I ask another question?
Please. Anytime, anyone, feel free to ask, please.
So the current protocol that we looked at is for baseline, but I'm wondering, when we do the actual experiment of eating spicy food, how would we go about it so that there's minimum motion artifact from chewing the food?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the current thinking, we haven't finalized it, is in my case, I have a cayenne pepper extract. It's a liquid. So yeah, I know, it's gonna be amazing. That we're doing that next week. So it gets diluted in the water, and I'm going to be using a straw so that hopefully all I have to do is sit here. There will be a motion artifact, but the thing is, the motion artifact should be at the boring part, the part that we don't care about, right? Because it's not really the putting it in my mouth, the 3-second onset or anything like that we care about. So the way I figure is drink the straw, put it in, put the glass down, start the recording. There could still be motion artifacts, and depending on how spicy I make the mix, there could be all kinds of motion artifacts. I will point out one thing, which is, shouldn't be an issue with this time frame, but if someone sweats, that is going to mess up the EEG. Well, people often sweat when they eat spicy food. So depending on the intensity of the spice that you're going for, and if you get a sweat response, then potentially you'll have a window between the onset of the pain and the onset of the sweat response, because once you start sweating, it's gonna short out the electrode, and you're gonna get all kinds of spikes, and that's gonna be really hard to interpret. Start sweating, it's gonna short out the electrode, and you're gonna get all kinds of. Yes, it'll it's this the salt is conductive, and the water is as well. But when you mix the salt from your skin with the water, it acts sort of like as a conductive paste. So water, like John was pointing out, is a good way to increase the signal quality of an electrode if you just dampen it a little bit before you put it on. But if you have salt water or if you have sweat, that is not good. Another thing that I'll mention, just for anyone who's curious, if you're having trouble, if you use a silica or let's just say silica-based conditioner, you could also have the same kind of electrode spiking. So not on every device, not on every sensor, but if you have a subject that is just shorting your data out, you don't know why, ask them, like, do you use conditioner? And, if so, what kind? And if you check, if it has silica, some EEG devices will have a very hard time with that. Okay, so let me see. I'm going to share in a moment. But
It's a little bit surprising
that,
because, saline solutions should be quite conductive. Like why is salty sweat not more conductive than just straight water?
There's something about it, but I definitely have shorted out my Muse, recording it at an opportune time. I suggest maybe you check it out as well. I'd love to have some confirmation. Maybe this is just me.
Oh, I mean, I'm pretty sure that's straight. That's kind of common EEG law, but I don't have an extremely profound understanding of the chemistry of electrolytes.
Right.
But I thought salty water was quite conductive.
Yeah, it really confuses me why that doesn't work. But it definitely, doesn't work. And it's, I was surprised because, yeah, just like you said, the goop that you put on, the conductive gel is saline based, but sweat, definitely on the Muse, I experimentally confirmed it just no bueno. I basically had to make sure that I have the AC running to just avoid any potential sweat artifacts. Okay, so let me share my entire screen and get this out of here. Okay, so can you see my spider window?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So this is the power spectrum plots of the baseline. So this is baseline eyes closed. And what you'll notice on the front is I don't have the alpha bump, but on the rear, I do. So, definitely on the eyes closed, it
nice
seems
plots.
like I was
nice
able
plots.
to. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
The FOOF that we have implemented actually fit a pretty big peak, so we can use that whole calculation, which is, this was a 8.78 hertz peak with a power of 1.08. And,
oh wow, is that your alpha?
Yeah, that's my alpha.
Man.
Yeah, that really
talk
really
about drop it. Talk about sorry.
I was surprised. That was a pretty monster.
Jokes coming to me right now. But
no. I was definitely having a strong alpha experience on this one. There's no question about that. There's even a little bit of a beta bump and so on. But yeah, this is my baseline. Now here's another plot that we have, which is the amount of time spent in what frequency band. So my delta was very low. My theta was a little bit, bottom loaded, but as you can see, my alpha did not go above 10 hertz. So it definitely stayed in that 8 to 10 range and was kind of like right below it, which is what this FOOF shows us. Like we see that, hey, wait a minute, this was, 8.78, 9.74, and you'll see that the majority of the, peak frequencies in the bins were here. Similarly, if we look at the rear, that theta was way higher. And the delta was about the same, the alpha was about the same, but it's interesting how different the frontal theta was from the rear theta. And then finally, let's look at the band power. So let's see, we have the normal relationship that we're expecting, delta, theta, alpha, whatever. But on the rear channel, you can see that the alpha was very strong. And so it actually overrode the delta, and the delta became subordinate to the alpha. So now in terms of band power, most of the power came from delta on the front. And if you look at the rear, most of the power came from alpha on the rear. So it's kind of cool to be able to see those differences. And again, pardon the errors. I was doing horrible things to the script right before to get something functioning. So, you know, that's what we got. Now, let's take a look at the eyes open baseline to see how that was different. So copy. Cool. So let's rerun test 1, 2, 3. Okay. So what have we got now? Well, still had a big, ridiculous alpha peak. Theta was all the way at the end. Let's see here. We had pretty standard power spectrum up front, but the delta was definitely not super prominent on the front. In the rear, we got another big old alpha peak. So what do we see in this one? The peak is in the very similar place, 8.51 hertz. The power is a little lower, 0.8, and the bandwidth is a little wider, 1.94. So it's twice the width, a little less intense of a peak. But we have more beta, definitely a higher beta amount. And I'd say we're crossing a little bit into gamma here as well. So, you know, I felt more meditated with my eyes closed than I did with my eyes open. But definitely staring at a pixel for 3 minutes is very boring for me. And so I tend to zone out in a similar way. All right. So now that we've looked at these, let's take a look at actual stimulus. All right. Okay. So pretty standard power spectrum in the front. This doesn't look too interesting. You'll note that I've got more delta, less alpha, and my beta is kind of higher here. So it's like a 13 hertz instead of being down here in the 20s. So let's see what we see when we look at the FOOF. Pretty negligible stuff up front, which is something that happens to me on the Muse sometimes. Is it just, you know, depending on what you're doing, either the front channels are going to be great or the front channels are going to be not so great. But let's look at the rears. So now we caught a peak at 5.63. So we have a theta peak that was not present on any of this stuff previously. The alpha peak is not that, you know, equivalent to the eyes open, 8.75, power of 0.879, bandwidth of 1.53. And the beta is lower, the gamma is non-existent. So this is like a little more stimulus driven, similar to the open situation, to the eyes open baseline, but not as, you know, distinct. What did we see for the front frequencies? Kind of bottom loaded, alpha in the usual place, kind of a bulge around 9. That's typical for me. I often seem to have a 9 hertz alpha. That's like really consistent for me. But the rear peak frequencies, now evenly distributed, alpha as well, where it normally sits. What did I see for band power up front? Delta heavy, normal ratio, delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma in the normal distributions. And the rear had a decent amount of alpha, but it was nowhere near as, you know, clear cut as the eyes open recording, or I'm sorry, the eyes closed, where there was this clear transition. And the alpha was at the top and the delta was at the bottom. In terms of power, front power was largely delta. And here, the delta alpha are kind of in a better ratio, right? We're not seeing 40% alpha. We're seeing about 20% alpha. So definitely a little bit different than the two baselines. So let me not just keep rolling. Any questions so far on looking at any of these plots?
So for the violin plots that we see here, Uh, are they normalized for each band? Like the
Each.
y-axis, it seems like it's the it seems to be the same scale for all the different bands.
Yeah, you're really looking at the distribution.
Okay.
The distribution of the data, the way the violin plots are generated, they're going to be kind of normalized in size, but the shape is the way that I interpret them, certainly. So, if you see, let's see, some of these other ones here, this violin plot tells you something different than if it's just perfectly distributed. You're like, oh, okay, this here, it's kind of more on the low power side. I think we have the previous ones as well. So here you can see it's very smeared out, and here it's all rear loaded. So in terms of vertical height, the entire distribution is going to be kind of compressed, and the violin plots do this kernel smoothing thing. They're not as representative as a histogram, but if you're trying to just assess something visually, if you're trying to look at the difference between two things, they're a very, very easy way to just sort of approximate the coarse differences.
So when it's here, when the orange and the green are overlapping, it doesn't really mean that the bands are. I mean, the ranges are distinct, right? It's
Yes, yes. You can include. That's a visual thing, right? That's
okay.
because of the way violin plots are generated, right?
Okay.
They don't. The frequencies don't really overlap, but it'll insert tails so that it can create the violin shape.
Okay.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so these violin plots are, we wouldn't use them. They don't help you, like you can't quantify them. You wouldn't use them in a statistical way. But as a visual indicator of differences, we do find it, convenient to have something like this, and just it'll jump out at you without having to sort of try to analyze it in detail. Okay, and so let's look at the last one, the reading. Okay. Okay, and let's run this as well. Cool. So what I was hoping for, we do see it a little bit, which is the other frequencies, you don't get as much power differentiation with reading, but it tends to do some interesting things in terms of frequency shifting. So there's this very small alpha bump up front. There's this theta peak and beta and whatever. But here you can see that the theta is pushed up. And so the level of difference between that and the alpha is much smaller. The delta is not as active. So theta alpha activity is what I would expect when someone's reading. And you can definitely see that here we've got a 5.8 hertz theta peak, 6.9 hertz theta peak, and 8.5 hertz theta peak, or I'm sorry, alpha peak, and then the 9.7 alpha peak as well. So this is probably the main one. So what's interesting is this is the highest frequency peak on the alpha. You'll note 9.7 for the big power one of 0.824, but all three of the other ones were around 8.75. So this is something we noticed when doing reading tasks is it tends to shift your alpha frequency up for a lot of people. So it's neat. I really didn't expect that this would come out. But yeah, this right here is what I'm referring to. Sorry, let me see. I don't think I can zoom it, but I can definitely change the axis. No, that changes the font. I'll change the plotted figure size real quick, and we'll get that going. But basically, the fact that this is at 9.7 for the main alpha peak, and in all the other recordings, you'll notice that the main alpha peak is like 8.75 for the big one. Let's go back to the previous one. Let's see, 8.51, although there's also a 10 hertz component. So in general, 8.75 is like a really solid, reliable alpha peak for me. But the way that I can shift it upwards in EEG data if I want is by reading. So I think that might be a cool experiment for people. You know, if you're doing your own baselining, if you're doing your own collection, look at what your alpha peak is. Now you may not have FOOF running, so you won't get this kind of neat fit calculated for you, but look to see if your peak shifts to the right when you compare it, and that'll give you a sense of, you know, if the reading task is shifting your alpha. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing for a second, and John, if you're still working on things, I can try to take your data through this step if you want.
Yeah, so you've got the scripts there, right?
Yeah, I've got that script. If oh Jesus, camera. All right, I'm going to turn that off. Yeah, I've got the script. If I download your files, I should be able to just
go for it. I mean, what I'm doing is I'm kind of grabbing the data, putting them in data frames, getting power spectra, and kind of what you're doing there, but you've actually kind of have a bit more comprehensive pipeline lined up. So
right.
Yeah, definitely do that. And
okay.
I'm doing some of that in a slightly different way, which could be interesting to, you know, just possibly look at it slightly differently, or look at the coding aspect slightly differently, but not, I haven't yet done anything fundamentally different to anything you've been showing so far.
Great. So I kind of went through
really slick.
I'm glad to hear that. It was the hope, you know, what we were trying to do is make it so that people that are not neuroscientists can just run one of these scripts on a file and get all the info that they need, you know, prepackaged. That was the idea.
Yeah.
So that's cool to, I kind of went through the data pretty quick. Does anybody have questions about the analysis, the different plots, the different methods? I mean, we can definitely drill into like how to look at those, right? But you know, that's sort of like the starting point of what's the power, what's the frequencies, what's the power spectrum, where are things located, and then what can you infer from that?
Yeah, that was really cool. I'm curious about those violin plots. How did you generate those?
Seaborn.
Seaborn.
Is a graphing package, and it's open source. It's just like Matplotlib, but it will make way cooler charts as well. I don't mean to disparage Matplotlib. It's sort of the next fancier version of Matplotlib. So Seaborn has a plot type called violin chart, and if you invoke it on your plot, you will get one of those. Yep. And then there's all kinds of parameters you can use to tune how violin-y they look.
Really cool, thanks. Are you gonna share your code or?
That code, we're going to share John's code and put it on the repo. That code, unfortunately, is just something we developed as a startup kind of internally for like the ability to generate the reports and whatever. And so definitely the proper ways to use your tools, whatever. But I didn't want folks to be sitting around looking at nothing. So that's just like, okay, let me generate some plots using our stuff, but it's very broken. Like I had to do horrible things to it just to generate those, but this is sort of like the EEG section of the pipeline.
Cool. Sounds good, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. But we will have a repo, the Project Spicy, that will have our data, that will have the code. We're going to have Jupyter notebooks so that you can load one of our files and see the things, or we're going to have Google Colab where you can literally just hit play and get the same data. So hopefully by next week, you'll be able to kind of play with all the baselines that we showed you today and do those representations. And then the Seaborn, you might need to, you know, hack in yourself, but it's a straightforward, you know, if you look at the code example, really it's just reading a CSV into pandas, running it through an EEG processing pipeline, and then taking the process data and putting it into some kind of plotting package. So, you know, maybe I'll see if we can also make sure to just include some Seaborn SNS plots in the notebooks.
Yeah, cool. And are all of those like analysis that you did so far, they're for the full 3-minute recording, right? There's no like time combined with frequency analysis.
The band power plot is the only one that has a time component. Let me share the screen real quick. Okay, here we go. So this has a time component. I believe we're using 4-second windows, and so that's why this is number of samples. 3 seconds of data, or I'm sorry, 3 minutes of data is 180, so 40. Yeah. So this is the number of samples. So this is off of a 4-second window. So that 180-second recording is like 45 or so 4-second windows. And this plot, the band power over time, front and rear, shows you the power in the bins at each sample point. So, a quarter of the way in, this is what was going on. Halfway in, there's a big alpha spike. Then it recedes, and then you have an increase in alpha, and so on. So this is the in time plot.
Cool. Yeah, thanks.
Sure, absolutely. And these are pretty standard methods. The violin plots are our own hackery, so you're not typically going to see that. But the power spectrum is a standard representation. This is going to be, a PSD command that you can do. SciPy does it. M&E does it. You can break this down with a Fourier. This also is a PSD. This is a software package called Foof, which is available on GitHub. And let me link that real quick. Can you still see my screen? Yes. Okay. The Foof package on GitHub will allow you to generate the same plots. So if this looks familiar, there's a reason for that, which is it's off the Foof package. So you can get the same kind of computations, and you can get the same kind of measurements. Before Foof, it was kind of difficult to quantify, these oscillatory peaks and where the activity was. It is really awesome that Dr. Wojtek's lab put this tool out there on GitHub, because it's a really nice way to quantify these oscillations in the EEG data.
I heard they're going to rename it.
Yes, Spectrum
Something.
Analyzer, something like that. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. Not sure I agree with that.
Yeah.
Cool. From what I understand, they've been contacted by people that are doing lots of signal decomposition, not just EEG. So they wanted to get away from the fitting oscillations over 1/f. And also, apparently, they don't think of it as a 1/f anymore, and they're not as interested in the oscillations. So they're going to spectral analyzer type of thing.
Right. I mean, sounds like splitting hairs, but sure.
Yeah,
I've been known to split some hairs from time to time myself.
Fair enough. So yeah, that's the Foof chart. Once you have Foof implemented, you'll get these violin plots are simply, of all the bins, of all 45 bins, sort of like a histogram. Where was the majority of them? What was the distribution of the bins that came in? So this is kind of like a cumulative summary of all the data that came in. And then here is the power over time. So basically, whatever window you pick, you can calculate the microvolts per hertz squared in each frequency range. So if delta is 1 to 4 and theta is 4 to 8 and alpha is 8 to 12 and so on, you just take the frequency bins, sum them up, and that is the band power for delta, theta, alpha, etc. So all you're doing is breaking the signal into all the component Fourier bins. So you take, in this case of the Muse, we're going to get 128 hertz that we're going to have signal resolution on. And depending on the size of the window that we're going to use is going to determine how fine or coarse that resolution is. So if I grab 1 second of data off of a Muse, I'm going to get back 128 values representing bins, 1 hertz through 128 hertz. If I do 2 seconds of data, I'm going to get 256 bins back, which still represents 1 to 128 hertz, except instead of going in increments of 1, so like 1 hertz, 2 hertz, 3 hertz, 4 hertz, like we did with the 1 second, now we're going to be going in half hertz increments. So we still have 128, but we have 1 hertz, 1.5, 2, 2.5, 3, 3.5. And in this case, we're using a 4-second window. So that's going to give us quarter hertz resolution. So we're going to get a value for 1, 1.25, 1.5, 1 3/4, 2, 2.25, et cetera, et cetera. So you're trading temporal resolution for frequency resolution. In the case of the 1 second window, you know that data is representing whatever happened in just that 1 second. And in a 4-second window, you're grabbing all of that 4 seconds and calculating. So you're not as precise in time because all you really know is that this was over 4 seconds, but you are more precise in terms of frequency. And then since you're doing that in a repetitive way, you're doing that every 1, 2, 4, 8, whatever, how many seconds you choose, you're going to get a series of representations at each one of those. And that's what this band power plot is. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing there. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and grab John's data and see if we can do the same thing.
So yours was recorded with NeurotechSF, right?
Yes.
Mine's recorded with Mind Monitor.
Okay.
It gives there's a column name raw _channel, which I think might be the same as what you're getting with Muse LSL. So kind of assuming that you're just loading it in and then kind of grabbing a column, then it should work the same.
Okay.
But the Mind Monitor files have more in them. They have like all the power in different frequency bands and a few other things, as we saw last time.
Oh, yeah. That's probably gonna... Okay. So, yeah. It's gonna... Cool.
I'm actually just pushing a notebook that loads in the data.
Oh, okay, perfect. All right.
That'd be useful.
I think that's great. I'm going to stop sharing and stop embarrassing myself as well.
But yeah, I mean, the pipeline you have is really cool. So if you could kind of pull it and push it through there, but maybe the notebook that I push will be helpful for just parsing it to start with.
So it's given me a hard time downloading the CSV raw because it's given me like I've had this issue in Firefox. Let me try this in Chrome. Yeah. All right. All right. I'm gonna stop sharing. Good Lord. No, I'm not sharing. Okay, cool. Let me spend a minute and figure out how to download this from because I don't have Git clone. Been lazy. I have the Git. I do. All right.
I just have no alpha. Okay, I have a little bit of alpha in the TP10.
Right.
It was, I mean, the plot that you showed, the alpha, that was from 3 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm aware that I have kind of lame alpha on news to me.
It's fine.
It's sad.
Okay, Project Spicy and data. All right.
Where is your ground electrode?
In the very front. It's right in between the two front electrodes. All right.
Oh, so I pushed a notebook that people are free to, you know, exploit my personal data.
Mm-hmm.
I don't
I'm stoked about that as well. I have to tell you.
That notebook that I just listed there, I mean, you could click on it and it's got some plots in, but it's also got the code to load it in. And just plot some power spectra. I'm still working on it, so I'll push an update shortly, but could be useful. Not right. So there's. I'm just kind of looking at it and trying to make sense of it. I don't know how long you spent poring over that stuff, Alex, before you went into the descriptions, but you seem to have a clear idea of what you're looking at.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's see. I think it'll barf just because depending on what the column names are. But if we really wanted to, we could grab the raws, stitch them into a file, and I'll let you all witness this monstrosity. So let's see. This is going to be all right. So because this is called a hack night, I will subject you fine folks to it. And let's try it.
All right.
So,
yeah, that was always the idea, right? With these recordings, we're going to be hacking and discussing stuff.
All right. So So we're going to have the timestamps column. We're going to need to code that in. All right. So this needs to be called timestamps, and it's not going to like this at all, but I'm just going to pretend like it's going to be fine. Okay. Yeah, let's see. Mixed D type, specified D type I import or set low memory false. Okay, so that's on the load, and then I think we're going to have, let's see. All right, let's try the simpler approach. I mean, this is horrible, but that's what we're doing. So I'm going to do Alex baseline 1, eyes closed, and I'm going to copy it to test 1, 2, 3. Right, but not while it's actually open. Okay. So this is going to give us a file in the right format for our stuff. Now, what we need to do is Frankenstein in some of John's data. So let's do that. We're going to open up the eyes closed baseline, and I think that's the equivalent. Okay, so yes, that's what we're using. All right, so now it's time to merge the data. Now, in terms of timestamps, I'm actually going to leave these because we don't care that they're inaccurate, right? And it's going to give us what we want. So in Mind Monitor, you're going to have all the DSP computed columns first. So that's going to be, let's just put in a table so we can actually read this. Yeah. So first up is a timestamp, and this is going to be in human readable format. And then you're going to have things like the delta values and the off the different electrodes. So here is the delta power for TP9 for this bin. Here is for AF7 for this bin. Here's AF8, TP10, et cetera, et cetera. And then it goes through. So once it does delta, it will iterate through theta. Then it's going to do alpha. Then it's going to do beta, gamma, et cetera. Then we get to the good stuff, which is the raw electrodes. Okay, so we have a bunch of other stuff, gyros, quality fit, how much battery. But let's grab this, which is the raw, and let's grab this, okay? And, all right, sorry, I'll do the whole column, and then I'll rename it. We're going to call this, then we're going to stick it in here, and then we're just going to call this TP9. Blam. All right, so let's keep splicing. We're going to throw in AF7. We're going to throw in AF8. And we're going to throw in TP10. Cool. Now we need to fix the column names. Okay. And if we did this right, hey, okay. Well, John, it looks like you did, unless I've got the wrong data. Let's see here. Did I save it? Maybe I didn't save it, or maybe it didn't save. Okay. And let's pop in a new kernel, just so we have a comparison. Okay. Hey, here's John's data. Okay, helps to save. So let's look at what we've got here. Okay, so it looks like there's, we don't notch at 50 because we're not in Canada. So this is just we do bandpass from like, I think we cut at 50 hertz, but this plot will show uncharted stuff. So that's why it's not grayed in and whatever. But it looks like we have some spike harmonics in this baseline. So I see like a beta peak and a gamma peak. Both of these seem a little questionable. And it did grab the AF7 electrode based on the signal qualities. So that's what we're looking at here. For the rear, we've got TP10. And yes, as John predicted, that ginormous alpha that we were seeing earlier, let's compare Alex to John's peaks. Okay, cool. Here we go. Sorry for all the scrolling. Yeah, so this is what it looks like when I've got my, or sorry, this, and this is John's data. So strong delta, strong theta. Don't see a lot of peaks, but this is a very canonical frequency spectrum. The front looks a little bit questionable because of these spikes, but you know, if you ignore the spikes, the rest of it is probably in the realm of reality. Okay, so now let's look at the power spectrum. Sure enough, Fu finds this
averaged over. So hang about. Did you have one of those plots for each channel?
Yes, it just grabs one front and one rear.
It, yeah.
In this code base, yeah. Although we could enumerate all four.
Oh no, wait.
AF7 is the front electrode that it chose based on...
I want to know if TP10 has a bit... I'm looking at my plots right now, and it's like a little bit of an alpha bump on TP10. Is that also kind of come up a little bit in those you've got there?
Kind of. There is a tiny... I mean, there's a small bump at...
Oh, it's not so clear, is it?
No. at least in this, we do average, right? So
which
maybe
one did you load in? Eyes, what are we looking at right now?
Eyes
open, eyes closed. Eyes closed.
Is that the one you're looking at?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a big bump, so probably it's just a question of, scaling.
Right.
But I'm kind of judging the barrel here for alpha.
We could definitely take a look at the other recordings and see what we see there. And again, we're splicing it in, so this is a hack on top of a hack. It could easily be that I transpose the columns or something, and that's why it looks silly. We can double check that sort of thing. But yeah,
similar. It looks similar to the ones I've done.
Okay. In terms of peak power, the deltas on the low end, the thetas are right around 5 hertz. Alpha on the lower end, just like me. So I'm usually around 8 to 9. You're right around 8, I think, or 9 in this case. Then beta is on the low end. I tend to find that people either have a low beta or a high beta. It's also kind of task driven, but either I see a lot of activity around 15 or I'll see a lot of activity around 24. In terms
so for
of
these plots, you just take a range and then do a violin plot?
Yes. So we calculate the, similar to this plot, right? Except if you were to take all of these bins and look at the distribution, you would get these violin plots. So we do 45.
Over time. That's over time then.
Yes. It's the cumulative total of how much out of all the data, what did they spend the most time in? What frequency bid?
Yeah, and you had moving windows. What? Remind me the moving windows?
4-second windows.
4-second moving windows, right? Cool.
Mm-hmm. And the front has very clear delta. Typical distribution, no crossover between the bands that I see. Delta, theta, alpha, beta, gamma in the usual ratio. Here is delta, but then over time, this theta is creeping up. And there's a crossover event right here near the end. So definitely, I would say something interesting was starting to happen in the second half of this recording. Maybe that was you getting not sure how long it was going to last and sort of like that anticipation, or maybe this is like, you checking your phone or something. But, this pattern in the first half looks dissimilar from the pattern in the second half. And I think to Nevi's question, I might even interpret something like this, like, well, maybe I was getting bored and really starting to daydream in the second half. So maybe I'll only use the first half as my baseline. I'm not saying definitively that's what I would do, but if you had a recording like this and you wanted to say, okay, I want to compare this part because this really seems kind of quiet and regular and it's right off the start, you can do that when using a baseline. You can say, I like this as more representative than this. And if you do multiple baselines, you'll get a feel for what is more representative, what is more common, and then you can grab that data.
This is the eyes closed, right?
Yes.
That definitely nodded off.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
So maybe this is like a slight nap?
The delta goes up.
That's pretty funny. So you were actually getting kind of like relaxed, kind of maybe falling asleep a little bit?
Oh, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
well, there you go.
I'm like, this is because I have narcolepsy, so I can just like fall asleep like that. So I close my eyes, I'm like gone in like 20 seconds. So
that's amazing.
This kind of thing, it's just it's interesting to try and pick out the differences, but that's like about 20 samples in, isn't it? I'm not sure what the kind of timing is there, but
yeah,
you get a kind of kick in the delta after a little bit. And if I was to kind of predict one thing after like 30 seconds of sitting there with my eyes closed, it'd be a boost in the delta.
Right. So there it is. Wow, that is so cool. I certainly wouldn't have known that about you, John. That you fall asleep very easily, and that's fascinating. That the difference came through in the contrast of the baseline.
Do you see the same delta elevation even in the frontal electrode?
Not really. And this is again. Let's talk about the Muse. This is the shape of the Muse headband, and there's this magnetic conductive or electrical strip in the front. If you look at the device, there's kind of like it's set in from the front, and then there's this little plastic thingy that kind of holds it forward, and whatever. So this is the strip. If you look at it, you'll see sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 little modules. There's like a little thing here, and there's like a smaller one. Then there's a larger one in the very center. There's a smaller one, and there's a whatever. I don't definitively know if it's the larger or the smaller of the side sensors. That's the AF7 and the AF8, but these are these two. And then this is the reference. So the TP9 and the TP10 are back here. The way the reference works is whatever voltage and power these electrodes measure, and these electrodes measure, the reference is subtracted from them. And the thing is, because of this proximity, because of this location, the reference really cuts the signal that the front electrodes see. Now, for what the Muse is designed to do, measure coarse changes in frontal alpha. This works perfectly. Like, this is absolutely sufficient. But if you're using the Muse as a general purpose EEG, one of the quirks of this design is that these electrodes will have significantly less power and significantly less, contrast between various things than the rear. But the unfortunate thing is these are in a great spot. You really want to see frontal, and these are in a not so great spot. The temporal lobe, still interesting, but not quite as interesting as the frontal. So that's why for a lot of things, for certain kinds of things, you're only ever going to see it in the front. So you just make do with what you got in the front. But the reason that I often find the front PSD less interesting than the rear is because the rears are not as attenuated by the reference electrode.
So are there any specific scenarios when you would get some interesting information from the frontal electrodes, and specific scenarios where you would get more information from the temporal? Like, generally, which electrodes are used for what type of information or applications?
That is a very, very good
Maybe
question.
it's too
No.
big a question.
That's a very, very, very good question. Okay, so in terms of there are going to be certain tasks, and I don't mean to be vague about this because it's hard to just sort of pick one from an experiment off the top of my head. I might be able to find, if I go back in our data and kind of look, I'll be able to give you a specific one, like, reading versus whatever. But there's certain kind of tasks that you're just not going to see a very interesting response in the TP9 and TP10 electrodes. And you are going to get something out of the front electrodes, even though it's going to be a little bit cut down compared to what you want. So for anything involving like executive decision-making control, you're probably going to see a lot of good frontal delta in some cases. It's hard to say, but basically, if you know that what you want is on the front, then with the Muse hardware in particular, you're going to deal with that and say, okay, maybe I'll just do a bunch of comparisons on frontal. Yeah, these electrodes aren't super sensitive, but you know what? All of my recordings have that issue, so I can still compare the data between conditions. Sometimes you'll get useful comparisons, sometimes you won't. TP9 and 10 are slightly noisier because of the way that maybe this isn't true for everyone, but we've seen it in a lot of studies and whatever, because of the way that the muse sits on your skin, when you blink, the rears do tend to move around a little bit, and the signal comes through very clearly. So you're going to get very clear blinks on the rears, but you're going to get good signal for a lot of things. So in the case of the muse, you could alpha is really what they're trying to measure, and if you consider that they pick locations that'll try to get them good alpha, then this is what they're trying to get while you're meditating. So they can use the front electrodes, the rear electrodes, but this design has an intentional limitation because they didn't want to make you wear an ear clip. The way that one solves this reference problem is by using an ear reference, or you can do it in other ways too, but then the ear is going to be, the ear lobe is going to be different enough from all the other signal that it's really not going to do a whole lot in terms of dampening your signal as much. So yeah, this is a little bit on the Muse specific side, but most other devices with ear clips, you're not going to have this challenge. And in the case of the Muse, you know, I just look at it like, just be aware of the limitations. The TP9s and the TP9 and TP10 are more sensitive. You're going to get more stuff. You're going to get a little more noise. You're going to get more blink artifacts, but you're going to get much better signal. And then AF7 and 8 are more noise resistant by virtue of the reference being right there, but it tends to dampen the power by like half compared to the rears.
Great. Thanks.
Sure.
Oh, sorry, I have one more
No,
question.
please.
So for your experiment with the spicy food, what is the hypothesis that you are expecting? Like, what are you expecting to see in the alpha? Sorry, not alpha. The frontal and the temporal signals, and is it going to be more about subject comparison, how they react to spicy food, or is it more about generally when people eat spicy food, what is the response?
That's excellent.
Probably both.
Well, because John was kind enough to give us a lovely little contrast, let's use this as an example. So the hypothesis is that we may see changes in theta related to the experience of the spicy food sensation, and in a more limited way, the pain aspect of it. That's the hypothesis, right? If this is slightly painful, we should see a change in the theta. But, you know, I typically, when I'm looking for a contrast, don't try to predict where I'll see it, and I don't even try to predict what it's going to do. So maybe the theta is going to drop. Now, I wouldn't expect that, but it could easily do that. Or maybe we'll see a slow building of the theta where it kind of creeps up like the delta did here. Or maybe like there'll be a sudden jump, and we'll see a very clear shift in the distribution of these bands. Like maybe the theta is going to somehow be at the top. I wouldn't expect that, but it could, right? And it could be that we see a change in the front, and it could be that we see a change in the rear. So this is what I enjoy about experimenting with things that I haven't done before is you really do get surprised, or at least I do. But I would like to see a visually observable shift in the theta pattern if we compare those two files.
Awesome.
So we're looking for this orange line to do something that catches our attention, and that hopefully if we put the two next to each other, the baseline to the spicy food intervention or manipulation, whatever you want to call it, we should see something that tells us, oh, okay, I can see a difference here. And maybe it'll be in the foof, maybe it'll be in the amount of time that is spent in what frequencies, maybe it'll be in the power, but that's what we're looking for, right? Like, let's find a contrast.
Great. Thanks, Harsh.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. Okay, so let's go ahead and save this. Cool. So this is our eyes open recording. And let's, you know what, just to make it easier, let's make a console for each one of these, and then we don't have to scroll through nightmare stuff. By the way, you guys can see my screen, right? Yes. Okay. Cool. All right. So what have we got here? Now, this recording seems a little choppy. What have we got on the raw? Yeah. So here we have some noise artifacts type of thing. And it seems like there's 3 or 4 of them in the data. So I'm going to call this a little noisier baseline. We still see a good power spectrum. This one seems to have higher, powers across the board than the eyes closed did. Don't really see any peaks that jump out at me. I mean, these are all like sub 200 in power, so they don't really kind of seem very prominent. We do have some, this alpha beta smear type of thing, but this seems pretty non-specific. So I would say like this is actually a pretty good baseline. I'm not sure why we have cuts here. I think this is during the spikes, and we trim
the NAs. There's the NAs in the data.
Right.
I had to remove them.
Oh, okay. Let's see.
I think there are.
Wow, this is a decent. Let's see if we can find. Did you remove them in the file that you uploaded? Because I grabbed it from the repo.
No.
Or did you remove it from the pipeline?
No, I just found that I had to remove them in the analysis.
What's the string?
Say again?
Is there a string? Like, does it say n/a or na or?
Let me have a look. I found that I had to do drop NA with pandas.
Oh, okay.
That was basically why I think that's the case.
Oh, yeah. There's a. Cool. What the heck? All right, let's try this again.
Oh, actually, maybe not.
Oh no, I nuked all the timestamps.
Was it one of the specific files?
JDG baseline 1 eyes open. All right, let's.
7 NAs in every column. Or 7 nulls. 7 is nulls.
Okay, so they're probably missing. No, nope. Well,
An issue, unless
we'll
it's interfering with something later.
Yeah, we'll see if maybe we can try to figure out how to remove it. I will save these and rerun it and just sort of make sure I didn't mess something up. Cool. Yeah, looks about the same. Okay, cool. So those are the 2 baselines that we're looking at. We should be all good. And let's make a new console. So yeah, I would say the eyes open baseline is looking pretty good for comparison on John's data, because that looks representative, and aside from the noise, I think we get a pretty good clear picture of the baseline. So yes, there's a little bit of cuts here, but we can see it's what we expect. Delta theta, alpha, beta, gamma, usual ratios, nothing too excessive, no big crossovers of the bands, a little bit of alpha activity here, but just completely normal. Okay, so let's look at the article and the YouTube. All right, so let's start with YouTube. Cool. Okay, so I'm gonna dump these out and grab the raw channels. Cool. Excellent. All right. Cool. Saved, and let's go. Okay, well, I think this generated a lot more activity. We have various peaks in the front and rear that were not present before. I think that this beta peak is absolutely legitimate. And I think that this theta, alpha, beta peaks at the front of the bands are all legitimate as well. So let's see what we've got here. Let's just take a look at PSD to PSD. Okay, so if we look at the front, here is the contrast between the two. So signal levels went up. The scale here tops out at negative 0.4. Here we go up to negative 0.2. So the absolute values are higher. And also we just see more activity. Like here, there's delta, there's this 5.5 theta. But here I would say this does look more active with the theta peak at the stop. So this is kind of like the 1 over F typical frequency distribution. There is an alpha peak at, I think, 8.75. Then there is a beta peak at 23 and change. And this does look like a very clear beta peak. And then there's a gamma peak at 30. So all of these bins look like the peaks are at the lowest frequency, which is something that we see sometimes. And then on the rears, again, there's good activity that seems different and more oscillatory than our baseline. So we're starting to have peaks where, here's a theta peak, here's a delta peak, here's an alpha peak, here's the beta peak. So it does look different. I wouldn't say that I see anything, remarkably different in the data. Here, there's this crossing into beta. We have a lot of activation into gamma. And here, this just overall seems much more active, whereas, in terms of peaks and activity, but I don't see anything too distinct. Okay, so let's look at these. So this is an interesting shift. During the baseline, we're very evenly distributed, but during the video, just like we saw in the data, we're really kind of front-loaded towards the bottom of each band. So delta's near the bottom, theta's near the bottom, alpha's near the bottom, beta mostly near the bottom, although we get a little bit of that high beta, and then gamma is near the bottom. So not super wacky, but if you look at some of the other ones, like definitely different for this subject. Okay, cool. And let's look at the rear. So in this case, I would say that this looks really similar, although again, I would say we have a narrowing. So this is the baseline. It's a little more smeared out. These are gentler slopes. So we spent still a decent amount of time in the low frequency bins, but not as much. But here, again, we see that kind of concentration in the low frequency bins. So John, would it be fair to say you might have been a touch bored? Or did you find the video interesting?
I wasn't super gripped, no.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I would have guessed from your data, that you weren't
really.
Yeah, that you weren't really feeling it. Just
Yeah.
not a lot of.
What are the signatures you'd be looking for again?
Just more activity, and the fact that everything seems to be kind of focused on the low end, to me, just doesn't look like a very specific kind of processing. It just kind of looks like a default state. Like you're just there like, I wonder if this is going to be any good at some point.
Right.
That's that. I mean, I obviously this is very interpretive, right? But it's just sort of me spitballing type of thing.
Yeah.
I would have been surprised to hear you say that you loved it.
Well, you're pretty accurate on that.
All right, and let's look at the article. Do we get some cool data in there? All right, so test 1, 2, 3. Cool, let's dump this out. Okay, so excellent. Those are the ones we care about. And let's read the columns. Right. Okay, so this is reading the article. Okay, so what do we got here? All right, so looking at the raw, pretty clean. There's some stuff around the 30,000 sample mark, a little bit of electrical noise. And then on the rear, you can see that there's a slightly more regular spiking. This is probably blinks because those do come through very clearly on the rear electrodes. That's why with a lot of this Muse stuff, as we mentioned last week, using a threshold-based standard deviation pruning is really helpful. If you just grab all of these samples that are spiking and zero them, that's a lot better than leaving the spikes. So just, depending on how fancy you want to be, but just grab some threshold 2, 3, 4 standard deviations. Say if the data point is outside of that, replace it with 0, and that's how you despike. Okay. So here, front doesn't look super interesting, although I would say that the gamma is quite elevated compared to the other stuff. You still see that distribution where kind of the front of each bin is the strongest. Beta doesn't seem to show a bump or any kind of rise in the front. In the rear, look at this huge theta spike, and that's really cool because that's quite different than the other data. Then you've got an alpha peak at 8 hertz. I mean, it's not ginormous, but it's definitely there. And now you've got a beta peak at 13.5, and the gamma is settled in. So I would say that this theta peak is the most interesting feature. And the fact that we are seeing an alpha bump is cool too. But yes, this 5.6 hertz 0.322 spike is what I would consider like, hey, this is a sign that John is reading something. So in him in particular. And I'll just point out that if you're thinking, hey, this is pretty subject specific, and when Alex reads, he gets this giant spike that moves 1 hertz, and when John reads, his spike is in the theta range. Yeah, that's really normal with this stuff. One of the things that makes interpreting EEG and doing EEG studies difficult is how different each subject is. Now, it's not always this big of a contrast, but sometimes it is. Sometimes half the group responds one way, half the group responds the other way. You average those two things out, and you've got nothing, except that's not accurate at all. You have these very, very different responses. So I think this is actually really, really cool to see that, for John, and we could try replicating it, do another baseline with John, have him read a different article, see what happens. But, the hypothesis from looking at this would be we expect to see a theta increase that is significantly different than baseline. So let's look at, this was the baseline, I believe. And this is the rear. So this compared to this, I do feel that peak is more prominent, and it does clearly define. It's still not super, night and day definitive, but that's where I would be looking for follow-up contrast. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing for a minute and turn the camera back on. All right. So That is the ever so delicate art of trying to grab meaning, visually inspecting EEG data. Now, there's many other methods, component analysis, the quantification, the FOOF, averaging, summing, dividing. There's so many other ways that you can try to extract meaning. But this is sort of the visual inspection, frequency analysis type of thing. Great. And so, John, would this be a good time to take a look at this same data through maybe the notebook, if you think that that's ready?
Yeah,
we can
sure.
just take a peek at
Yeah,
Mhm.
I just literally pressed push, so
Would this be the
People
wrong
still-
time to throw in some biology?
Oh yeah,
I
sure.
noticed
I'm
that
sorry.
that Alex, you're a male and you're a mammal.
Yes, I
And
believe
everyone
so.
knows that, yes, hot peppers excite us, but what
Yes.
excites us most of all? And the answer is lovely ladies.
Oh dear.
And
All
it
right.
would be interesting to do the same thing, but bring in something that represents your most lovely lady, whether
Oh,
it's
dear.
just the sound of her voice or her walking across the room or 10 other representations. Nothing too detailed, but
Sure.
I think that would probably, biologically, I know that that's got to be a tremendously important
Yeah.
stimulus. And I would expect that it'll show up dramatically in brainwaves.
Yeah. I definitely think that that's one of those ones that like we're going to have a like EG After Dark series of tests with like alcohol, pornography, stuff like that.
No, but
Naughty.
even if it's milder, just
Right.
her breathing,
Right.
that
right.
will in fact
Yeah,
have a big
different
And it would be interesting to compare that with, how do you pronounce your name? Neva? A woman where the whole pattern I would expect would be very different.
Yeah, and these things came up. So, for instance, we have an eye tracker that we use in most of our experiments, and obviously people are going to look at different things. And so, the number of times that it's been suggested to us, like, hey, show like a spring break video and see where people look. Right, that would be a lot of fun. Like which people in what order do you consider interesting, when they pan around the crowd and stuff like that? But those, for NeurotechX, I try to pick the tame experiments wherever possible. But I agree with you, like those are really fun experiments to do. Honestly, that's why, like, if you go through this Hack Night series, I encourage you to try something fun with your data collection and see what happens. Audio response of someone that's like a loved one or someone that's like really important to you would be great, right? Have them call and just do a baseline and then have a phone conversation where they're just talking to you for 3 minutes. That would be wonderful, right? You would get a different contrast, or some other way to provide a contextual stimulus. But what I would say is, yes, stimulus that you administer is good, but the more that you engage with whatever it is, the more that you're going to get a good contrast in the EEG. So if you can somehow get people to change their processing a little bit, or change like the intensity of what they're doing, that tends to generate good contrast as well.
Yeah, I also think like for the main series and like, because a lot of these videos we want to be somewhat child friendly,
Right.
down the line, as it's going to be important to keep a lot of them more middle of the road engagement wise, but do think like once things can be done in person, or if it's like we can also have people watch shows they like if any person who has had like a crush on a fictional character, which a lot of people have, or there's a movie where they really like a specific character, those like can also be interesting, and also to compare that with like someone you actually know in real life. Like how similar is your emotional connection to a character you like in a series to someone you actually care for? Like that's one of those things I think could be very interesting. Partly just because I love multimedia stuff, and the amount effort they put into making characters something you care for is something that's very artistic, but also it might be a bit scientific at this point, that can associate with characters really well. It
Sorry, I
might,
was just making sure. So,
yeah. I'm wondering if that's because of the writing or because people have gotten used to it. Like, I'd love to see the difference between like someone who's never really engaged much with media and how much they care for a character in media versus someone who constantly engages in media, and whether like people are predisposed this to like characters because they see so many characters. Like, or if it's just we innately care about characters in general. Like, I know Disney and Pixar have actually done this almost to a science. Like Pixar especially. If you can find any Pixar talks online about their character development and emotional interaction design, they've taken it to a science, and
Pixar movies would be good for engagement as well. I mean, think about that YouTube video.
Yes, that's an excellent example. Yeah, I just picked it because according to YouTube, it was like their highest engagement. But you're right, that's for a very specific crowd, right? It's gearheads that enjoy that sort of thing. Pixar is much more universal. I think it's an excellent. Maybe we can even try watching like a trailer for an additional contrast next week. I think that'd be kind of cool.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
So yeah, I'm going to try to dig up. All right. So John, feel free to share, and I'm going to try to dig up an example real quick to show some stuff. Maybe I won't get to it this week, but yeah.
I'll share. But what I will say is, I'll just go through kind of alternative ways of doing some plots and loading some data, not actually. Well, I mean, Alex did a great job of breaking it down and doing some comparisons. And I've been eyeballing this for a little while now, and there are a few things I would pick out, but there's not necessarily kind of loads and loads of I'd say interpretable differentiations here. But just at a kind of practical level, I mean, I cloned the repo and then made this notebook, and then I'm kind of committing some updates every now and then. But I made these files according to the naming convention that Alex said. I actually recorded everything with my monitor. So I pressed record on my monitor, and then when I pressed stop, it asked me what I wanted to do, just emailed it to myself, then downloaded the files and renamed them and pushed them to GitHub. And that's what I was doing right at the beginning of this call. So those are there. And then I just have a little script that loops through the files, loads in the files, picks out the raw time series, does this thing which I find to be necessary for the power spectra, is drop the NAs. So remove rows with all rows with the NAs in, compute the power spectrum with Welch, put the power spectrum in a data frame. Then this next bit is saving all of the above in a dictionary. And then finally, this next bit is kind of in a slightly dirty way, pulling out some specific stuff from this, like everything in their dictionary, specifically the power spectra for the different conditions. So that ends up in this thing, DFOPs and DFOPs norm, where the norm is divided by the sum. So it's like each. It's when you look at the normalized power spectra, you're kind of looking more at the relative patterns or shapes, as opposed to the absolute differences in the magnitude, which could be large, but sometimes you're more interested in the shape. So it's interesting to have both. So now there's just going to be a bunch of repetitive plots. So loaded in, and like first ones would kind of group them by recording, by which I mean let's have four panels for our 4 ones. This is YouTube, this is article, art, and then eyes open and eyes closed. And but actually I think the better ones, so there's then some other versions of this, like so this is the log plot, as in you can see the x-axis is logged as well as the y-axis, which is it's quite useful for actually looking at the 1 over f, because that's like how the 1 over f is defined as a straight line in log coordinates. But not always the most intuitive thing to look at. So I also did a semi-log y plot where the x-axis is frequency, and you can kind of look at it a little bit more intuitively. So eyes closed, eyes open, YouTube, article. But oh yeah, and then there's the normalized spectra as well. But I'm kind of skipping through because I want to look at these other ones where I'm grouping them by channel. And this is a bit easier, makes more sense to me, at least for comparing the conditions, because we have them on the same plot, which wasn't something that Alex was doing actually.
Right.
But so I have here for each of the 4 channels, a power spectrum for each of the 4 conditions. And we can see now, I mean, interestingly, actually, the absolute value of the low frequency part in the eyes closed is quite low. Mm-hmm. It's lower than any of the others. So that was a little bit surprising to me, especially seeing as there was that kind of high delta stuff that Alex was showing.
Right. I think it's because the overall thing is low, so it looks higher when you look relative, but that whole plot is pretty low.
So if you're looking you look at the normalized, okay, so this should be normalized right now, yeah.
So John brings up a wonderful point. I'm so glad that you're showing it in this form where you can see it. Each visualization is going to help you see something, and it's going to be slightly misleading in its own way. And the best analogy that I've come up with is, and feel free to tell me how bad it is the different lenses on a camera. All of them are capturing the same scene, but if you're using a 35 millimeter lens or a 100 millimeter lens, it's going to look very different. And if you think about those forced perspective shots that they were doing at the start of the pandemic, where people were like 20 feet apart, but you would line them up on a zoom lens and it would look like everyone's lined up, that's an example of how your perspective can mislead you. So the thing that I would greatly encourage is as many different comparisons that you can think to come up with. It's probably not a waste. It's not difficult to come up with an iteration or a few lines of code that will give you a new representation, but don't be shy about exploring these. Why limit yourself to 1 or 2 views? Try 20 and see if the contrast between them starts to inform you in addition to what the plots themselves say, because every single way that you pick it, it will have some aspect that's a little bit, hard to interpret from that particular plot. So really cool that we get these examples.
Right. So actually, the thing that sticks out the most here to me is in the normalized power spectra, the eyes closed actually has a broadband increase in the relative power, as in, so yellow here for all of these is above everything else, quite far above the other ones, especially for example in this one, for kind of, let's see, 5 to 30 hertz basically. So that would be what you'd normally think of as broadband, but also when people talk about the 1/f, the background part of the power spectrum, this looks like it's got it looks like, actually, to me, I've not got the foof fit here, but it looks like an increase in the intercept. Then it's like just a broad, it's just been pushed up. The orange has been pushed up relative to the others. Not necessarily the typical thing you're looking for with this comparison, which maybe you're seeing there actually, is the eyes closed to have a much bigger alpha than the eyes open. There is an alpha there. I mean, you can see it in this one, at least in the eyes closed raw.
Double check that. Yeah.
I have a little, pathetic little alpha bump, and possibly it's, enhanced from eyes open to eyes closed, but you have this big broadband difference as well. So it's actually even in the normalized, it's hard to kind of look at them directly together. So I'm not as much of an expert as Alex as kind of looking at these kind of things and doing them with sliding windows and thinking about the kind of real-time mental state of the person you're getting the data from. I tend to do more like person who's been zapped with a giant magnet versus person who hasn't, or person who has a kind of major neurological illness versus person who hasn't. So the kind of Jamesian stream of experience isn't something that I'm studying in the same kind of way. So I don't. So I just have these dull plots.
I mean, these are quite interesting. I think it's great. So the script that I'm running today is a script that's designed to be kind of pointed at a single file. We have scripts that do comparisons between files, and then we have scripts that do multi-file comparisons. But the thing is, like, the way we structure our data is so different. So I whatever. But I'm sure I could write like a converter where we could take like any of these files and put them in a format and whatever, just for the analysis. But yeah, I mean, I think that these recordings are interesting. The talking about the foof exponent or whatever, maybe the normalized plots are an easier way to show this, but the two parameters that the foof tries to model are sort of the shape of that curve, how sharp it is, and also like what is how quickly does it flatten out, right? Those are sort of the two characteristics. And then the second aspect is what is the height, the intercept of it. So one of the things that Dr. Wojtek shows in his studies, if you, let's see, fitting power spectra. Yeah, it didn't look like you were feeling it to me. All right, let's. Oh, right, you're sharing. Okay,
Yeah,
excellent. That's what.
I'll stop
No,
that.
yeah. I'll just share real quick. Okay. Okay, power spectra. Right. Sorry. Okay, cool. So this is the paper. And this is talking about like oscillations and the power spectrum and these kinds of changes. Let's see if we can get this a little bigger. Okay, cool. So here's the kind of things that we're looking for. The FOOF is calculating the aperiodic slope. So if you look at John's plots that are normalized, they really show this very clearly, that there's a shape to this drop. And if you put it in log, you should get a straight line like this. So these particular are log on the power, log on the frequency. And that's why this is tending to form a straight line because it's in log notation. So if you look at it, when there's no alpha oscillation, that means that the alpha band is at background power. So it does not deviate from that slope. And when there is an alpha oscillation, that means that there's going to be a peak that rises over. So here you would say there's an alpha oscillation and probably a beta oscillation. So here are some of the ways that these peaks move around. They can drop in power like this. They can, the whole 1 over f can move. So in this case, it drops and shifts a little bit to the right. Then here we have a 1 over f that's really similar, but the alpha shifts back in the band. So you go from a high alpha peak to a low alpha peak. And here's one, and this is, I think, the most similar to the data John was showing, where you get this shifting and flattening of the frequency spectrum, the 1 over f. So that is, these graphs will kind of show you some of the canonical changes that you can expect in that frequency spectrum when you're analyzing it. And then, here is some of the components that you're going to get out of that. If you looked at the raw, this is what you would see. If you looked at the filtered, this is what you would see. And then there's ways to calculate white noise and pink noise. But yeah, this is the aperiodic fit. They walk you through how they fit it by removing the peaks, then they fit a line to the D peak data, then they restore the peaks, and then they calculate the fit of the peaks. But the main thing I wanted to show is it's this 1 over f can be, sorry, this is going to be time for more horrible paint. It can either be kind of sharp like this, or it can flatten out and then still have a bump and whatever. So typically what a lot of this comes down to is the ratio between the delta and the gamma. That's not really how it's computed, but you can think of that as sort of like an indicator for what that means. So if you have a drop in delta and you have a raise in gamma, you're going to see this flatter type of structure because the delta is not as high, the gamma is not as low, so you're not going to draw as sharp of a curve in terms of descent. And if the delta goes up and the gamma goes down, you're going to get a sharper curve. So obviously it's fitting the entire frequency spectrum and whatever, but the delta gamma relationship is there and drives a lot of the changes in this frequency spectrum that you see. So I think that
the argument would be from those guys that the correct way to think about it is not as delta and gamma per se, but as the slope line itself, because that kind of encapsulates the kind of high-low relative values, which are quite you're quite right. Like that's going to be driving the slope of the line, the difference between broadly like those two bands. Yeah.
Right. It's not the right way to think about it conceptually. Conceptually, you should think of FOOF as the frequency fit for the whole spectrum. Functionally, if you see a big drop in delta and a big increase in gamma, it's going to very dramatically change the slope of the 1 over f. And so that's, some of the
broadband though, not peaks.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Yep.
broadband shape, right? So maybe if you can share your notebook real quick.
Okay.
And we can just take a peek at the broadband
That's
shifts,
done.
you know, with what we know.
Yeah. So it was the normalized, and then we had looking at it by
Sorry,
channel.
I might have. Maybe you can share it again.
Yeah.
Okay. No.
This was the normalized, and it was grouped by channel. So
yes, I see it now.
So we have the different tasks kind of next to each other, and the one on the right there, I think it's kind of interesting because you got a rotation, the top right. That would definitely, I think, come out in Foof as a rotation, especially as there's no actual peak really there. But you've also got two kind of degrees of the rotation. You've got the orange and the green, right, which almost look like they're kind of going further in that direction. But certainly the orange relative to the blue and the red on the top right plot there, that will be an example of the rotation relationship. It's like you've pinned it in the middle, more or less, where all of the things cross over.
Right.
And then you're just kind of seesawing the orange one a little bit further up to the right.
Yes. And if we look at them in semi-log, I think we can also kind of see that, right? This is, again, a slightly different way to look at it. But if you look at the TP9 and 10, you'll see that the low frequency bands, the delta has dropped. So, you know, it is closer to 10 to the -1 than the other ones that are above it. So that delta drop combined with the gamma, at least on TP10, being kind of at the peak, creates this shallowing of the frequency spectrum, and I would think that that's less active decision making, which seems very consistent with the eyes being closed. YouTube is sort of like the second lowest in terms of the delta activity and, you know, having that elevated gamma. So that also seems like it was boring. And then eyes open and article, you know, both seem like you were fairly engaged. Again, we're just using TP10 as the sole contrast here.
Yep.
So yeah, the sharpness and the flatness of that curve, these are all fairly nuanced interpretations, but they can help guide you in terms of what are the differences between these conditions. And assigning real world meaning to those differences is the tricky part, but observing how the data changes can help you start to paint a picture of what it is that's different about these conditions.
Sorry. How the eye similar response, because to me it looks like the article was also boring.
Well, the reading doesn't seem to generate a lot of power, or at least I've rarely found one that does. But what reading seems to do is generate, you know, frequency spectrum. So one way that we can think about the analysis is simply to reduce the complexity of everything else, the sharpness or the flatness of this slope. Right now, is that a canonical way to look at it? No, but for the comparison, we can definitely make that. So let's hypothesize that the sharper the slope is, meaning the more distinct the drop between the delta, the low frequency, the stuff on the left, and the high frequency, the stuff on the right. The greater the drop, we're gonna just for the sake of, you know, interpretation, say, well, maybe that means this, and then we can kind of like step through it and see if that makes sense. So we can say, okay, you know, eyes open is definitely the bottom in terms of power, right? As we step through these, it's typically near the bottom, but it does generate this sharp peak and this sharp drop. So it's got the lowest gamma. And that's just seems to be kind of sitting there, whatever. But it's a very sharp line with low power. Then the red line has this very interesting kink. I'm sorry, knee is what Foof calls it. They call it a knee. So there's sort of a knee with the 7 and 8 electrodes in particular, because you're expecting this certain drop, like you're expecting it to go all the way, down. And in the rears, it does sort of follow whatever. But in the fronts, and I would think that reading would be kind of frontal oriented, right? We see this big shift once you get past 10, 15. The line almost gets horizontal, and that's quite different in the front than some of the other bands. Like the most significant deviation from whatever the slope was through 9, and then suddenly, at 10, it's horizontal. So that's really interesting to me. Okay, so what do we see in the green? It's pretty sharp. The signals are elevated, and there's a lot of gamma. So, if you look at the front electrodes, you say, well, okay, this seems to be kind of up there with reading, right? I don't think this plot really gives us a good contrast there, but the front has more power. So we say, all right, more processing raw was being done to, compare these two things. And then the last one is this orange one, and then that's very different from the others because we've got a little bit of sleep state in there. So we see that the power is a lot higher. We see that the delta power is lower, even though we started to see these peaks compared to the other data. But compared to the other recordings, right, this does seem to be different. The slope is very shallow in terms of the angle. So I would say something like, the front electrodes seem to show more interesting contrast if you're trying to understand the implications of reading. And then for other tasks, it might be the readers that give you a better contrast.
I would concur.
Okay, yeah, I'm still trying to understand. To me, the YouTube, the green one and the red seem to have similar slopes and like similar patterns, even though the power might be higher for the green in the higher bands, I guess, beta and gamma, right?
Yeah. Well, we can always try taking a look at them again in the plotter. So, or the little pipeline that we have. Just a moment. Let's see if I can load up those two in particular. I have too many consoles open, so I'm confusing myself. But yeah, let's throw in John's data on YouTube and reading, and we'll run those two, and then we'll run my data for YouTube and reading, and let's see if we can get a useful comparison. So we'll look at those 4 things, and we'll get some extra cool subplots from John as well. All right.
Yeah, just looking at the similarity of the power spectra since you were asking about which ones kind of look most similar in their pattern. So let's just take a look.
Okay. All right, so John, I'll share with the screens real quick. Sorry, the plots. So you can click on my screen if you like. Okay.
I think there's one square bracket on the in the third subplot.
Yeah, nice one, thanks. Sorry, Alex, I need to click on yours, you're saying?
Oh no, if you click it again, it'll turn it off if you want. Then people can suffer through my screen share. So you just go back to the way that you shared it, the Jitsi thing, and then click that little screen share button on the bottom. Yeah, that one.
Got it. Okay.
All right. So this is the YouTube data. So I just finished transposing it. And let's run that real quick. And I'll make a new console while that's processing. And let's grab the reading information. Okay, cool. And yep. Okay, so let's see if this is completed. Yep. All right. And now we're going to run it on this permutation. Cool. All right. So we're going to generate that one. And let's generate okay. Let's do that one. Did we do the article first? Oh boy. I think we did YouTube first. So I'm going to do YouTube, then article. Okay, let's do YouTube. Great. Done. All right, so let's do article. Ah, crud. Look at that. Pushing buttons. All right. 4. All right, let's do that again. Cool. So, I'm just going to back this up to the top, and here we go. So, what are we seeing in these? All right, so let's go to the top. Now, I don't have the multi-electrode contrast, so we'll just step through them and do it manually. And let's see what we got. Great. Cool. Okay. So first off, in terms of the raw, all of these look decent. Let's get to the PSD. Okay. So again, you can try to flip through them and get some sense of it. All right. So this is the YouTube. Mm-hmm. And this is what we see on the front electrode. And here's what we see on the other one. So it's a different way of looking at it, but these don't seem horribly dissimilar. Now, I would say that there's a beta peak here that is interesting. Now, is that like somehow informative? Would I guess that someone's watching a YouTube from this peak instead of reading an article? No, I wouldn't have any way of kind of seeing that in the data. So both of these look pretty similar, but what I would draw attention to is, this is flatter. Okay, so even though it's not really plotted as cleanly, we can look at the variables on the foof, but to me this looks a little bit shallower, where the difference between the delta and the gamma isn't as pronounced. And in this midsection, this elevated beta that John pointed out, and I think there's the foof will show it a lot better. This elevated beta seems to be the biggest difference. So, kind of like this article seems to, just drive a little more of this midline bump, whereas here, here there's like this slight increase, and here it's just, at lower levels.
The second one is for article, right?
Yes, I believe so. I believe this is YouTube. Good Lord. No, this is backwards. The first one is for article. Okay. Because I remember this power spectrum. The second one is for YouTube. So let me do the other ones properly. Article, then YouTube. So let's copy those over. Well, all right. So that is what we have right now. Okay, so that's going to be article. And okay, that's done. All right, and then do it again. Okay, cool. So on the rear, though, I would say that, you know, the structure looks a little bit different. Again, this is subtle stuff. You know, this is off of Muse. This is 4-second windows. So some of this stuff is going to be a little bit notchy, but let's just try to interpret it. There is a delta peak that's kind of high. There's a theta peak. There's an alpha peak. There's a beta peak. There's a gamma peak. It's unusual to see peaks in everything at the lowest frequency. And that was kind of one of the things that came out about the data. This one has some similarities, but the delta is kind of sharper. The theta is pushed to the middle instead of being at the start. Okay. The alpha is in the same spot, roughly 8.75, 8.0, so a little bit different. But it's not that different. You're right. Like this is really marginal. Like if you didn't give me the labels, I wouldn't be able to really distinguish. Okay, so let's look at it with the foof overlay and the fit. All right, so let's look at, here are the parameters for the aperiodic. So the first part is the offset. The line is intercepting at 0.0.
Can you zoom in a little bit?
No, I can't expand the photos because they're freaking fixed DPI, and I can fix it for next week's call. It's just going to be ugly today. I can zoom the font, which is super awesome, but not the images. Or maybe I can use Windows Zoom.
Yeah,
Wait.
Windows Zoom might work.
Where did I save this? Okay, I'm going to save it on my desktop. TP9. Goodness. All right. Where is All right, so cool. Well, at least we can zoom in a little. How about that? So, yeah, these are really subtle. I mean, it does not jump out in terms of difference. These are similar looking 1/f's. And, you know, I would say like reading often doesn't generate a huge contrast in terms of power. And the YouTube video wasn't interesting. Okay, but here's the parameters that we can look at. The offset intercepts at 0.06. So that's going to be a little bit off the screen because we're clipping it. But the exponent determines the sharpness of this curve. So again, you know, it's kind of a numerical representation. It can be a little bit tricky to interpret, but the smaller this number, the closer to 0, the flatter the curve is going to be. The larger this number, like 1, 1.5, 2, the sharper that this slope is going to be. So it's hard to always see this on a plot, but like this one has an exponent of 0.8334. This one has an exponent of 0.6858. So this is shallower, right? This is, if you look at these two fits, you can see that, you know, on the article, the 1/f is 15, 20% sharper than, you know, it's hard to put these in numerical terms, but it is more prominent in its downslope. And here it's a little shallower. And then also the activity increases are a little different. Here you've got this little bit of an activity in low frequency and then moderate activity across the band. Here, the low frequency is more pronounced, and you know, this is shifted, like it's shifted to the right, whereas this is shifted to the left, more towards the beta side of things. But this is really subtle differences. And on the rears, the slope of this is 0.904. The slope of this is 1.1. So this is actually sharper on the YouTube than it is on the reading. And here the activity is more constrained to, you know, 5 to 25 range. Everything else is largely, you know, noise level. Where here, again, very, very similar, but I would say more more interesting low-level activity, more elevation, more peaks, more whatever. Let's look at a different comparison, my data, and see if we're able to catch any differences between these two conditions. So we know that in the order that we did these in, it was article first and then YouTube. So when I look at an article in the front, it's really not all that different. Let's try to get this lined up pixel-wise. Yeah, you look at that contrast, it doesn't seem super different. You know, this is a little bit flatter alpha. It's negligible difference. Okay, well, let's look at the rears. So we got alpha, all right. So the peak shifts forward. The delta is pretty low on both of these. The beta gamma is pretty similar. So really, I would say that the YouTube has less theta, right? It's the drop that's kind of noticeable. Here, the theta when reading is kind of forms this flat horizontal line. So the theta is pretty high, the delta is pretty low. Here, it looks like, you know, there's a little bit of a theta bump, but again, not the most amazing contrast. Like it's an excellent observation, like in terms of interpreting it. And here are the numerical representations of the peaks. And again, if we look at the fit lines, the slope here is 0.91. Here it's 0.76. So for me, the slope is flatter when I'm reading. And here it's sharper. The peak is 8.75 here, 8.5 here. So really not all that different. There's a 9.7. That was sort of that shift increase. So really the only thing I can point to is this 1 hertz shift. And I know that seems really subtle, except I've done a lot of recordings. And I know that it's really, really hard for me to get my alpha above 9 hertz. I can't do it. Really, unless I'm reading, in which case it will go to like 10.
Okay.
So an example, if Ryan, do you mind if I share what we saw in your reading stuff?
Oh, go for it. I actually want to see
sorry to
that.
interrupt. I'm gonna have to drop off now, guys.
Oh yeah,
because my brain is trying to turn off.
Okay, cool.
I need to
Thanks, John. Have a good night.
So sorry to check out early. This has been really great, and like really loving the visuals here. I really hope we could write down some minimal version of some of these visualizations, maybe in the repo, because it'd be
I think that'd be great.
nice to see.
Mm-hmm.
Cool.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's
See you guys.
fine showing my.
See you next week. Bye.
Yeah, Alex. It's fine showing my data.
Cool.
Also, I'd love to see it since isn't some of that in a CSV, like showing that you can take data you gathered years ago and do new analysis on it.
Yes, exactly. Okay, so let me do the following. I'm going to cut off the recording. I think we've had a great night analyzing everything. And then for the few folks that are still here and want to suffer through it, we're going to look at some cool data. So I think that's going to be interesting as well. All right. Thank you all for joining us. Please
Alex,
feel free to oh, yes.
Could you please give me your email address? I want to ask